The cold, silent night crept through the open windows, filling the house with an eerie stillness. Alice, sitting alone with a half-empty cup of tea beside her, stared blankly at her phone. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock, mercilessly marking each second. It was 11 p.m., and the house had fallen into complete silence. Alice tried to keep calm, but there was something heavy in the air. She always felt uneasy being alone at night. It was as if something or someone was watching her. The old house she lived in was filled with invisible memories, its walls alive with unfamiliar sounds, especially those that echoed from the basement. Her hand reached for the TV remote, hoping the noise would break the silence. Suddenly, she heard a noise from upstairs, a faint sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Alice looked up. Her heart skipped a beat. "I must have imagined it," she whispered to herself, but the soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, challenged her belief. They were faint, but unmistakable. She cautiously stood up and made her way toward the stairs. Her hand clutched the banister as her heart thumped heavier with each step. When she reached the top floor, nothing seemed out of place. The doors to the rooms were all closed. But at the end of the hallway, the attic door was slightly ajar. The same door that was always locked and one she had never opened. Alice took slow steps toward the door, but the closer she got, the colder the air became. The atmosphere felt dense, and there was an odd, musty smell lingering in the air. Her hand trembled as it rested on the door handle. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open. The door creaked loudly, revealing the dark, dusty attic. Only shadows filled the room, nothing more. She took a step inside, but suddenly, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the house, and a suffocating silence settled in. Alice fumbled for her phone in her pocket. When she finally turned on the flashlight, its weak beam barely illuminated the space around her. That's when she saw it, something at the far end of the attic. A shadow detaching itself from the wall and moving toward her. At first, Alice refused to believe her eyes. She squinted, but the shadow only grew larger and came closer with each passing second. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. Who's there?" Her voice trembled as it echoed in the stillness of the room, but no response came. The only sound was the heavy, deliberate footsteps of that shadow, moving closer and closer. Alice's breathing grew shallow and rapid. She couldn't take it anymore. She turned and ran for the door, but in that instant, she felt something grab her from behind. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the silent night. She yanked her arm free with all her strength and bolted down the stairs. Her heart pounded as if it would explode. She burst through the front door, escaping into the cold, dark street. Out in the open, standing under the dim streetlight, she didn't feel safe. She turned back to look at the house, her eyes scanning the windows, and then she saw it. In the window, the shadow stood there. The same shadow from the attic, now staring at her through the window, smiling. A large house with glass walls and a pool in the middle of the yard took on an eerie vibe at night. Laura had recently moved into this new home, a place that felt more like a luxurious fortress than somewhere to live. Everything seemed modern and appealing, but from the moment she entered, a strange feeling lingered in the air. That night, the sky was cloudy, and a cold wind swept through the trees in the yard. It was 10 p.m., and Laura was alone in the house. Lying on the couch with a glass of orange juice, she half listened to the quiet sound of the TV. But something felt off, almost as if the calming sound of the pool's water lapping against the edges was more unsettling than usual. Laura glanced toward the large windows overlooking the pool. The water was still, but a shadow seemed to be lurking at the bottom. She took a deep breath and got up from the couch. Maybe it was just the faint lights around the pool casting strange reflections. But the more she looked, the clearer and more solid the shadow became, resting deep in the water. Laura chuckled to herself. "It's just my imagination," she muttered. Still, she decided to take a closer look. As she approached the pool, she stopped at the edge, gazing down into the calm surface. Her own reflection rippled slightly, but beneath it something else stared back. A face smiling at her. For a moment, Laura couldn't breathe. She blinked, focusing harder on the water. She was sure there was something or someone there. Suddenly, the yard lights flickered and went out, leaving only the dim glow of the moon casting long shadows around the pool. Her breath quickened. She couldn't move, as if something had rooted her to the spot. Fear crawled over her skin. With a rush of panic, she turned and hurried back into the house, slamming the glass door behind her. Inside, everything seemed calm again, but a faint noise from the yard caught her attention. Was it the sound of water rippling, or footsteps slowly approaching? Laura glanced toward the glass doors, but all she could see was the dark, still pool. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. "Come outside." Laura stared at the message, confused. Another text followed immediately. "You've been waiting for me. I'm in the water." Her heart began to race. It had to be a prank. Maybe one of her friends was messing with her. But who would play such a cruel joke? Just then, a soft knock echoed from the glass door. Laura spun around, her eyes wide with fear. No one was there. Another message popped up. "Can you see me now?" Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she hesitantly moved toward the window. She glanced at the water. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't hers anymore. It was smiling, an eerie, twisted smile, and then it began to move. The reflection stepped out of the water and walked toward her. Laura screamed, stumbling back, her legs catching on something as she fell to the floor. When she looked again, nothing was there. The house was deadly silent. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind struggling to process the nightmare she had just witnessed. Then she heard it, the faint drip, drip, drip of water behind her. With trembling hands, she slowly turned around. Wet footprints trailed across the floor, leading from the pool, right to where she stood. A low, raspy voice whispered from the shadows behind her. "It's your last night? Alone." The night was closing in, and the sound of wind whispered through the branches of the large trees in the yard. Emily lived alone in the old house her father had left her. It had a vast yard full of ancient trees whose rustling leaves provided a constant backdrop of noise. Her only companions were her dog, Rex, and a cat named Nala. That night, everything was unusually quiet. Emily stared out the window at the yard. Rex sat near the gate, and Nala wandered along the garden wall. Emily sighed and headed to the kitchen to make herself a cup of coffee. She often tried to enjoy her moments of solitude in the peaceful nights, but tonight, something felt different. As she poured the coffee into her cup, Rex suddenly began barking, loudly and aggressively, as if something had deeply unsettled him. Emily quickly turned to the window. Her dog was standing rigid, staring intently at the gate, while Nala darted toward the house at full speed. "What's wrong, Rex?" Emily called softly, but a sinking feeling gnawed at her stomach. She opened the door and stepped into the yard. A cold breeze blew through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. Rex kept staring at the gate, growling quietly, but there was nothing there. No people, no animals, just darkness. Emily walked over to Rex and gently stroked his head, hoping to calm him. But he remained tense, as if something in the shadows of the large yard was threatening them. Suddenly, Nala hissed loudly from somewhere near the back wall of the house. Startled, Emily rushed toward her. Nala was sitting on the garden wall, but instead of looking toward the yard or the house, she was staring up at the sky. Her gaze was fixed, unblinking, as if she could see something beyond Emily's perception. "Nala!" Emily called out in concern, but the cat didn't even flinch. Emily looked around the yard again. Everything seemed normal in the dark, but there was a growing unease. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe Rex and Nala were picking up on her anxiety. She turned back toward the house, but just as she stepped inside, she heard a soft sound coming from the trees. A whisper, faint and indiscernible. Emily froze. The whispering grew slightly louder, but there was still no one in the yard. She debated whether to go toward the sound or retreat into the safety of her home. Her heart pounded in her chest, and despite the chill in the air, sweat formed on her brow. "Maybe it's just the neighbors," she muttered, stepping back outside. Rex was now closer to the house, tail lowered, standing completely still and staring at the trees. Nala had jumped down from the wall and was silently trailing behind him. But what Emily saw wasn't a person. It was shadows. Shadows seemed to dance between the trees, shifting and moving, though there was no light to cast them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the shadows. They moved, but there was no source for them. She wrapped her arms around herself, taking a step back toward the house. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. A heavy, oppressive silence settled over everything. But before she could take a full breath, the shadows surged forward, rushing toward the house like a wave of darkness. Rex barked wildly, and Nala let out a sharp yowl. Emily turned and ran for the door, slamming it shut behind her in a panic. She stood, breathless, staring out the glass door. The shadows had stopped at the edge of the yard, motionless, as if waiting. There was nothing visible about them, but their presence was overwhelming. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she rushed to close the curtains, but she knew they were still out there. The whisper started again, but this time, right outside the window. Emily sat huddled in the corner of the room, heart racing, as the shadows crept closer with each passing moment. Lisa had always enjoyed her quiet, solitary nights. Her house, located in the suburbs, was peaceful and far from the bustle of the city. But tonight something felt different. The air was heavy, as though something lingered just out of sight. It was around 10 p.m. She sat on the couch, with the TV quietly playing a show she wasn't really paying attention to. Deciding she needed some tea, Lisa got up to head to the kitchen. Just as she stood, the phone suddenly rang. Lisa frowned. This late at night? She wasn't expecting any calls. She walked over to the phone and picked it up. "Hello?" There was no answer, just silence. She listened for a few seconds, not even hearing the faint sound of someone breathing. A bit unnerved, she hung up. Maybe it was the wrong number. Lisa started toward the kitchen again, but she hadn't taken more than a few steps when the phone rang once more. This time, she rushed to answer it, her nerves on edge. "Hello? Who is this?" Again, there was no response, just silence, until after a few moments, she heard a faint whisper. It was barely audible, but she caught the words, "We're coming." Lisa froze. Her blood ran cold. She quickly hung up the phone and stared at it. Her heart raced, and a sense of dread settled in her chest. She tried to brush it off. Maybe someone was just playing a prank, but that voice, it sounded so real, so close. She decided to return to the TV. The quiet murmur of the show helped ease her nerves slightly. But before she could even take a sip of her tea, the TV screen suddenly turned to static. Lisa stared at the screen in shock. A moment later, the image cleared up, but it wasn't the show she had been watching. Instead, the screen now showed a live feed of her garage. The dark, empty space with her car parked in the corner appeared on the screen that Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't have a camera in her garage, yet the footage looked real and immediate. She grabbed the remote and tried changing the channel, but no matter which channel she selected, the same image of the garage remained. Suddenly, something moved on the screen. The garage door began to slowly lift. Lisa jumped to her feet and ran to the window. The garage door was indeed opening, but she didn't recall hitting the opener. Panic surged through her. She rushed to the front door, checking all the locks. Everything was secure. When she glanced back at the TV, the garage footage was still showing. But now, someone was there. A tall figure dressed in black, with a face obscured by shadows, slowly stepped into the garage. They moved silently, deliberately, and were now walking toward her house. Lisa's heart raced as she ran to the phone and dialed the police. But the line was dead. No dial tone, no sound, just silence. She tried hanging up and redialing, but nothing worked. On the TV, the figure continued moving closer to her house. She could see them approaching the front door. Lisa didn't know what to do. She was trapped in her own home, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might burst from her chest. She slowly approached the window again, trying to catch a glimpse of the front yard. But before she could see anything, there was a soft knock at the door. Lisa froze, staring at the door. Someone or something was outside. The knock came again, this time a little louder. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. Silence. She cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there, but before she could even let out a sigh of relief, The TV suddenly went black, and the entire house was plunged into darkness.